Well, the last of the last. The last of the nervous system stuff. And that's the autonomic nervous system. Remember, this is a subdivision of motor. So you had central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. In peripheral, we had sensory versus motor. In motor, we have somatic, which is skeletal muscles, versus autonomic. And in autonomic, we have sympathetic versus parasympathetic. The autonomic nervous system, for the most part with one exception, has two motor neurons going to its effector. And again, we've got two different types, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is long-lasting, okay, because it's not only nervous, but it is also some endocrine. And those hormones stay in the blood for a while. And because of that, you have these effects over many, many minutes. Sympathetic nervous system effects are also diffused, meaning they're all over the place. And part of that is because the sympathetic neurons are all over the place. Their nerves branch all over the place. And also because of the fact that it results in the release of hormones. And so those hormones going through the blood can have target cells all over the place. Conversely, parasympathetic tends to be short-lived. It's pretty much neurons only, and it tends to be very, very localized. As far as function is concerned, parasympathetic kicks in when you're calm or you're relaxed. It lowers blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate. It stimulates digestion, defecation, and diuresis. It increases gastrointestinal tract motility. It opens blood vessels in the skin, so your skin tends to warm up, and it can also constrict pupils. In the parasympathetic system, those neurons, to a certain extent, kind of fire in the background, and that background firing is called parasympathetic tone. Parasympathetic tone helps to slow your heart rate on a continuous moment-to-moment basis. It prevents it from over easily speeding up. It also is responsible for kind of normal background activity levels of the digestive and urinary systems. If you just ate a meal, then you would increase your parasympathetic stimulation. At any moment in time, if you're under stress, the sympathetic nervous system can override the parasympathetic. So parasympathetic is your background, and then if something scary or exciting happens, sympathetic kicks in. Sympathetic does essentially the opposite. It raises blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate. It is your fight, flight, or fright system. Those are its stimulus. It lowers gastrointestinal tract motility. It cools the skin because it constricts those blood vessels so that you can move blood elsewhere. And it also dilates the pupils to allow more light in. Remember, sympathetic kicks in when you're under stress, when the car almost hits you in the parking lot. Sympathetic system also is responsible for thermoregulation, temperature control, because of this ability to move blood in and out of the skin, and because of the fact that sympathetic nervous system innervates sweat glands. Sympathetic nervous system is involved in renin release in the kidney. That chemical helps you increase your blood pressure. So one of those reasons why it's long-term. Sympathetic nervous system stimulates your reticular activating system. Remember, that's what makes you alert and aware. And sympathetic nervous system affects metabolism. These two big gigantic words, you don't need to know what they mean. I'm just tossing them up there. Gluconeogenesis is a whole shift in metabolism, it's biochemistry, that allows you to make glucose from blood sugar from molecules that were not sugar to begin with. So you would break down proteins to do that. You can also break down lipids to do that, and that's lipolysis. So sympathetic nervous system, again, it's longer term and it's diffuse. You also have sympathetic tone. Sympathetic tone comes into play with our blood vessels because you have sympathetic neurons to them, but you don't have parasympathetic neurons to them. And so that a slow background sympathetic action potential on your blood vessels keeps their tone. If you need to constrict the blood vessels to increase blood pressure, then you just increase sympathetic action potentials. You send more. If you need the blood vessel to dilate, then you just do fewer sympathetic potentials. This chart is all the anatomy stuff you need to know. On the way top, we see somatic nervous system. Remember, somatic goes to skeletal muscles. It is one motor neuron in the chain, and it's always acetylcholine. Sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic, is two motor neurons in the chain. The presympathetic neuron is short because it just has to go through the ventral root of the spinal nerve, out the ramicomunicontes, which are right on the other side of the vertebra, to the sympathetic chain where it might synapse. So the preganglionic neuron is short. That neuron releases acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter in the ganglia. Then the postganglionic neuron is very, very long. It goes from that sympathetic chain, or the ganglia it's synapsed in, all the way to the effector. Once it gets there, it releases norepinephrine as its neurotransmitter. The only exception to the two-neuron rule is in the sympathetic division, where you have one motor neuron going to adrenal medulla. That's a kidney or gland on top of the kidney. When you stimulate that with that sympathetic nerve, you cause it to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. Epi and norepi in the blood act as hormones, and they go on to do those metabolic effects, heart rate effects as well. All right, compare all of that to the parasympathetic nervous system. It's basically the opposite. It is a long preganglionic fiber, because that fiber has to go from the central nervous system all the way to the ganglion, which is at or near the effector. It releases, in either case, acetylcholine. So you should take a moment, pause the slide, and go over all of that anatomy. The other things we talked about are the fact that the nerves for the sympathetic nervous system are thoracolumbar. Okay, they come out of the thoracic and lumbar regions. We also looked at the fact that the parasympathetics are craniosacral. They come from the cranium on cranial nerves and then sacral nerves. So to remind you about that sympathetic chain we looked at a while ago, remember we have our spinal cord here, and we have this ventral root. Ventral root, I got it. Once we get outside the vertebral column, then we start to go on that ventral rami. But if it's sympathetic neurons, we take a turn. And the sympathetic neurons go down the ramicomunicontes to the sympathetic chain structure here. At that point, sympathetic neurons have options. Some sympathetic neurons will synapse in the chain at their level. Others will synapse up or down. Others will go straight through. We'll come back to that in a second. If you look macroscopically, here's the vertebra, and you can see this sympathetic chain here and the ramicomunicontes, this little pearl necklace that's right on the outside of the vertebral column. So that's where they come from. And remember, the thoracolumbar. The sympathetic neurons have their soma in that lateral root of the gray matter. So in this lateral root of the gray matter, you have the soma of your sympathetic neurons. And you can follow them on the diagram and see how they come out the ventral root to the spinal nerve, and then turn on the ramicomunicontes to this sympathetic chain. As I said, when they leave the lateral root of the gray matter and go on the rami communicantes and hit the sympathetic chain, one of three things can happen. Some of those nerves will synapse in their level of the chain on the postganglionic fiber. Some of those neurons come into the sympathetic chain and can go up and synapse at a different level, higher up, on the postganglionic. So there's option 1 and option 2. Option 3, some of these neurons come out of the sympathetic chain, don't synapse in it at all, and go to a ganglia somewhere else where they synapse. If that happens, if it's option 3, then 2 words get associated with that. The ganglia that are somewhere else are called collateral ganglia. They're not in the sympathetic chain, they're elsewhere. And on this diagram, you're seeing ganglia associated with the abdominal aorta, the big blood vessel that goes down your back of your body. The nerves that do not synapse in the chain, but the nerves that go all the way to a collateral ganglion synapse always have the word splanchnic associated with them. The last option is the adrenal medulla option. Okay, that's the one where you have just one neuron going straight to it. So in the sympathetic nervous system, you actually have 4 options. Remember, option number 1, go into the chain, synapse at your level. Option number 2, go into the chain, travel to a different level, synapse. Option 3, don't synapse in the chain at all, synapse in a collateral ganglia and become a splanchnic nerve. Option 4, the exception to the rule, go all the way to the adrenal gland. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap and intentional redundancy with the sympathetic nervous system. That's to make sure that no matter what, the body responds in a life-saving way. Remember, for your ancient ancestor, sympathetic nervous system kicked in when you were under stress, when something was chasing you or a war and tribe was coming after you, okay? And it was vitally, life-threateningly important that the entire body respond quickly and for a prolonged period of time. We compare that to parasympathetic, which is craniosacral. Remember, it's cranial nerves and then a couple of sacral nerves. Its background, it's about tone, it's about digestion and diuresis and defecation and lowering the heart rate and lowering the respiratory rate. So it doesn't have nearly as much redundancy because it just takes over when the stress is gone. It's equally important, but it's not quite so redundant. So you can see its pathway is very much more straightforward. Long preganglionic fiber, ganglion at or near the effector, short postganglionic fiber, all acetylcholine. So what I would say is pause this in a moment and go over all this using all the anatomy and the function we've been spending the last 13 minutes talking about. Okay, once you got an understanding of the 2 systems, and we can talk about some other related things. Dual innervation. Dual innervation means that all our major organ systems have both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers going to them, so that you have sympathetic and parasympathetic control. You have both. If you speed up the heart, you must be able to slow it down. That's the philosophy there. The only places you do not have both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers are the following: the adrenal medulla, the sweat glands, your erector pili muscles, those are the teeny little muscles in your skin that are associated with the hair follicle, your kidneys, and most of your blood vessels. And that's because here it's sympathetic only. It's all about that sympathetic tone. You either increase or decrease sympathetic, but you don't necessarily need the parasympathetic there. Okay, other little things we're going to go through. Visceral reflexes. Yep, they exist. Referred pain and neurotransmitters. Visceral reflexes, same concept, same type of reflex arc, same everything. These are polysynaptic, okay, even though the diagram doesn't show it. So these are polysynaptic, and it's the same concept. It's just traveling along visceral neurons. You'll do a lot of visceral reflexes in AMP2. You'll look at cardiac reflexes, respiratory reflexes, digestive reflexes, all the urinary reflexes. All those reflexes are visceral because they're using visceral motor neurons. All right, this concept of referred pain. This is when visceral pain is perceived as somatic pain. Someone thinks the muscles in their lower back hurt, but really it's the kidneys that hurt. That's because visceral pain afferent fibers travel the same pathways as somatic pain fibers. They land in the brain in the cerebral cortex, and sometimes the cerebral cortex can't always tell the difference. I'll give you an example. Someone who might have diverticulitis, an inflammation of their colon, of their large intestine, will often think they've pulled a muscle in their back. Their lower back hurts. And in fact, if they stand, with one leg elevated, sometimes that alleviates the pain. So sometimes those people will self-diagnose as having hurt their back. Unfortunately, after 2 or 3 weeks, the pain doesn't go away. They finally go to a healthcare provider and they find out it wasn't their back at all. So that's enough about referred pain. If it interests you, you can look at the map and see how any given shaded area of the skin and the muscles underlying the skin are actually associated with pain coming from a given organ because of the way the tracks travel together. I find this one odd, that the right shoulder, pain in the muscles of the right shoulder can sometimes actually be gallbladder malfunction. Okay, then we start to look at neurotransmitters, because here's the deal with the autonomic. Unlike the somatic, sometimes neurotransmitters are purely excitatory, sometimes they're purely inhibitory, sometimes the neurotransmitter is both. It depends on the receptor. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the different receptors. Receptors that bind the neurotransmitter acetylcholine are called cholinergic. See the choline in there that matches? Receptors that bind norepinephrine are called adrenergic, and you can kind of see the word root in there a little bit. Okay. Remember, cholinergic fibers binding acetylcholine are going to be on all acetylcholine, remember, is released in the ganglion for both sympathetic and parasympathetic. The parasympathetic postganglionic fiber releases it onto the effector. Adrenergics are the sympathetic postganglionic releases it onto the effector. So you're going to find adrenergics on the effector, and you'll find cholinergics on the effector. There are 2 types of cholinergics. There are 2 types of adrenergics. The 2 types of cholinergic receptors, both of which bind acetylcholine, are called nicotinic or muscarinic. Nicotinics can be found on motor end plates. That's somatic nervous system. They're the receptors found on the skeletal muscles. All preganglionic fibers have them. The adrenomedulla cells will have them. When you have a nicotinic, it is stimulatory. This would be acetylcholine binding to this receptor and making that cell get closer to threshold. Muscarinics are found on the parasympathetic postganglionic fibers. They can be stimulatory or inhibitory. It depends on the subcategory of muscarinics, and it depends on the effector. Adrenergic receptors, remember, bind norepinephrine. There are 2 types, alphas and betas. Even in the world of alphas, there's alpha 1 and alpha 2s, but they are stimulatory. betas, there's 3 subtypes of betas, they are inhibitory, except in the heart, where beta receptors are stimulatory. You kind of got to laugh because it's so frustrating at this point. Now, you may have heard of medications called beta blockers. Beta blockers are associated with conditions of the heart, and they block beta receptors. What would be the effect of that? Now, sometimes at this point in time, again, we've lost the forest for the trees, and people go, well, how does it even get started? How does an autonomic fiber know when to fire? And of course, it's always controlled by the brain. Stimulus about your environment, the fact that you heard and saw the car almost hit you in the parking lot, ultimately, remember, gets processed and integrated by your brain. That cerebral cortex stimulates the limbic lobe and vice versa. And both of those affect the hypothalamus and stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, remember, that's the boss. The hypothalamus stimulates the reticular formation of your brainstem, so that regulates the pupil size, the heart rate, the blood pressure, the swallowing, all that good stuff. And then those decisions made by the hypothalamus are sent down columns in your spinal cord, the lateral, the dorsal, the ventral columns in your spinal cord, to the appropriate sympathetic nerve, where it comes out and you have the chain and all that good stuff. Conversely, hypothalamus controls parasympathetic same way.